90-day shock. Brandon and Julia involved in terrifying car accident. Brandon and Julia had always been one of those couples that people quietly rooted for. Their story began with challenges, doubts, and endless cultural differences. But through every argument and every tear, they somehow managed to find their way back to each other. Life had finally begun to feel peaceful for them. Calm, settled, and full of quiet happiness. That Sunday morning was no different. The air was cool, and soft sunlight streamed through the trees as they left Brandon's parents' farmhouse. Julia had packed a small basket of apples from the orchard, and Brandon carried their travel mugs of coffee, the kind of small, ordinary moments that made their life together so beautifully normal. Inside the car, laughter filled the space. Julia leaned her head on the window, humming along to a song that had played on their wedding day. Brandon kept glancing at her, smiling every few seconds, the kind of smile that comes only from deep familiarity and love. They talked about future plans, about maybe buying a small piece of land, building a home of their own, and starting a family one day soon. As they drove down the narrow country road, the world around them felt peaceful. The trees lined up like silent witnesses, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Brandon told Julia how grateful he was that she had left everything behind in Russia to be with him. Julia smiled softly, saying she would do it all over again just to be by his side. Moments like these feel eternal, until they aren't. It happened so suddenly that time itself seemed to freeze. A truck from the opposite lane swerved unexpectedly. Maybe the driver lost control, maybe it was just bad timing, but in that split second everything changed. Brandon's eyes widened, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. Julia gasped, and then came the sound, a violent, deafening crash that tore through the calm morning air. Glass shattered. Metal twisted. The world spun out of control. When the car finally came to a stop, the once peaceful road was now a scene of chaos. The sound of the wind was mixed with distant sirens that grew louder with every second. A few bystanders rushed toward the wreckage, calling out, trying to help. Inside the car, Brandon's hand was still gripping Julia's. Both were unconscious, their fingers loosely intertwined. As if even in that moment of pain, their love refused to let go. The coffee cups had fallen to the floor, their contents spilling slowly across the dashboard. The apples from Julia's basket rolled out onto the road, red against the dark pavement. Small, ordinary pieces of life scattered amidst tragedy. For the people who arrived there first, it was heartbreaking. For Brandon and Julia, it was the moment that would change everything. A quiet, sunny morning that turned into the darkest chapter of their love story. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but to the people standing nearby, it felt like forever. The calm countryside road, where birds once sang and the trees stood still, was now flooded with flashing red and blue lights. Paramedics worked quickly, their voices firm yet trembling with urgency. Brandon was still breathing, though his pulse was weak. His forehead was cut, his face pale, but his hand was still reaching toward Julia. Julia lay unconscious beside him, motionless, her hair tangled with bits of glass, her face streaked with blood and tears. The sight broke even the hardest hearts that watched from a distance. As they were lifted into stretchers, a light drizzle began to fall, soft, cold raindrops landing on the twisted car, washing away the dust and blood. It felt as though even the sky was grieving. Inside the ambulance, the paramedic kept calling out Julia's name, checking for a pulse, whispering, "Stay with us, come on, stay with us." Brandon, fading in and out of consciousness, murmured her name too, barely audible, his voice weak and cracked. "Julia, please don't go." The sirens screamed through the quiet morning, racing against time toward the hospital in Richmond. Every bump on the road made Julia's heart monitor flicker. The doctors waiting in the emergency bay prepared for trauma intake. 2 patients, one critical, one unstable. The moment they arrived, the hospital doors burst open. Nurses rushed forward, wheeling Julia into surgery, while Brandon was taken to a separate room for immediate scans. The once inseparable couple was now separated by hospital walls, machines, and fate itself. Hours passed. Brandon woke up briefly in a hospital bed, his body aching, his vision blurry. The first word he whispered wasn't about himself. It was her name. "Julia?" No one answered right away. The nurse looked down, unable to meet his eyes, and gently told him, "She's in surgery." The doctors are doing everything they can. Brandon turned his face toward the window, tears silently sliding down his bruised cheek. The reflection of the rain outside blurred with the tears in his eyes. He whispered again, softer this time, "She's strong, she'll be okay," as if trying to convince himself. Outside the hospital, Julia's parents in Russia were being contacted. Her phone, recovered from the crash, kept ringing. Friends, castmates, people who knew them only as the couple who beat the odds. But at that moment, love and fame meant nothing. All that mattered was whether her heart would keep beating. The hours stretched endlessly. Machines beeped. Footsteps echoed down the sterile hallway, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. In one room, Brandon lay still, praying, remembering, breaking. In another, Julia fought silently for her life. And the world that had once watched their love story unfold on television now held its breath, waiting, hoping, praying that this wouldn't be the way their story ended. The night at the hospital was long and cold. The hallways were dim, lit only by soft fluorescent lights that never seemed to change. Brandon lay awake, unable to rest. His body was bruised, his arm in a cast, but the pain that kept him awake wasn't physical. It was the silence coming from Julia's room down the hall. Every hour, he asked the same question. "How is she?" And every time, the answer was the same soft voice. "She's still in surgery, sir. Please try to rest." But how could he rest when the person who made his whole life feel alive was fighting between life and death? He closed his eyes and remembered the first time he saw her. That smile, that spark in her eyes, that energy that pulled him in. Julia wasn't just his wife. She was the light that changed every part of his world. From the farm to the city, through fights, laughter, and tears, she had always been the one. Hours later, the doors of the operating room finally opened. The surgeon walked out slowly, his expression calm but heavy. Brandon tried to stand, his legs weak beneath him. "She made it through the surgery," the doctor said softly, "but she's not out of danger yet. The next 24 hours are critical." Those words felt like both a relief and a storm. Brandon nodded, tears flooding his eyes, whispering, thank you so much." When they finally let him see her, Julia was lying still, pale and fragile. Tubes and wires surrounded her, machines hummed quietly beside the bed. Her hand, the same hand that once held his with laughter and warmth, now felt cold in his palm. He sat beside her, trembling. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Julia, it's me. I'm right here." He leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against her hand. "You promised we'd go to the beach next weekend, remember? You said you wanted to see the ocean again. You can't break that promise now." His tears fell silently onto the blanket, soaking into the fabric. The room was quiet, except for the sound of her heart monitor, steady but fragile. In that silence, Brandon talked to her for hours, about their first date, their wedding day, the silly arguments that now seemed meaningless. He told her how sorry he was for every small thing, for every harsh word, for every time he took her love for granted. And then, just as he began to drift into exhausted sleep beside her, he felt the faintest movement. Julia's fingers twitched in his hand, barely there, but real. He froze. Then, for the first time since the accident, he smiled, a small, broken smile of hope. "Julia," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're still with me." Outside, dawn began to rise slowly over the city. The first light of morning slipped through the hospital blinds, soft, golden, and full of fragile promise. For the first time since the crash, Brandon believed that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. Morning sunlight crept into the hospital room, washing the walls in a pale golden hue. The quiet rhythm of the heart monitor filled the space, steady, soft, alive. Brandon hadn't left her side once. His eyes were tired, his body weak, but his hand still held hers, as if letting go might undo everything that had just begun to heal. Julia's fingers moved again. This time, not a reflex, a slow, trembling motion. Brandon's breath caught in his chest. He looked up, eyes wide, afraid to believe what he was seeing. Her eyelids fluttered. Then slowly, painfully, they opened. For a moment, she didn't speak. Her gaze wandered, unfocused, as if her mind was trying to piece together what had happened. And then her eyes met his, tired, broken, but alive. Tears welled in Brandon's eyes instantly. He reached closer, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead, whispering her name again and again like a prayer. She tried to smile weakly, her lips barely moving. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, a tear that said everything words could not. Doctors came in soon after, their faces showing a mix of surprise and relief. Against every fear and every odd, Julia was awake. She was alive. The recovery was slow. Her body was fragile, her voice faint, but her spirit, that fiery, beautiful spirit everyone loved her for, began to return. Brandon helped her sit up for the first time, held the cup when her hands shook, whispered encouragement through every painful breath. Outside the hospital, news had already spread. Messages poured in from fans, friends, and family. People who had followed their journey from the start, now holding on to hope just like Brandon had. But inside that small hospital room, none of that mattered. There were no cameras, no interviews, no bright lights. Just two people, scarred, broken, and yet more connected than ever before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and filled the room with soft orange light, Julia looked at Brandon and whispered, barely audible, "We got another chance." He nodded, unable to speak, his hand tightening around hers. The sound of the heart monitor was steady, strong. They sat there in silence, watching the sunset together, the same way they once watched it from their car on a quiet country road. But this time, every breath, every heartbeat, every look carried a weight, the fragile understanding of how close they came to losing it all. And in that silence there was no pain, no fear, only gratitude. Because sometimes love doesn't need perfection, or promises, or forever. Sometimes it just needs one more heartbeat. Weeks passed. The seasons began to change outside the hospital walls. Autumn leaves giving way to early winter air. Julia was finally discharged, her body still weak but her heart stronger than ever. Brandon helped her walk out of those doors, their hands intertwined, fingers trembling yet sure. The road home was quiet. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty, it was sacred. It carried everything they had survived. The pain, the fear, and the miracle of still being together. At home, the world felt both familiar and new. The coffee mugs were still on the kitchen shelf. The photo of their wedding still sat by the window. The scent of the farmhouse air felt the same, but they weren't the same people who had left that morning weeks ago. Julia walked slowly to the backyard, where the late sunlight touched the grass. Brandon followed behind her, staying close, afraid to let her fall even for a moment. She turned to him and smiled, that same soft, shy smile that had once started everything. For a long time neither spoke. They just stood there, watching the sky burn into gold. Finally Julia whispered, "When we were in that car, I thought I lost everything. But I think we were given another chance, to live, to love, to be thankful." Brandon didn't answer with words. He just held her tighter, his face buried against her shoulder, tears falling freely, tears of relief, of fear, of gratitude. That night, as they sat together, Brandon looked at Julia and said quietly, "I don't want a perfect life anymore. I just want this, you, me, and the chance to wake up every morning knowing we made it." Julia's eyes glistened. She reached out, touching the scar on his forehead gently, and whispered, "Then let's live like it matters, every single day." And so they did. In the weeks that followed they shared small things, coffee at sunrise, walks under the stars, the laughter that came easier now, softer but truer. They didn't talk much about the accident anymore, but it lived quietly in their hearts, a reminder of how fragile everything once was. The car was gone. The road they had crashed on was repaired. The marks of that day slowly erased by time. But the memory, the lesson, stayed with them. Because sometimes life breaks you, only to show you what really matters. And sometimes love doesn't end with a wedding or a promise. It begins again in the quiet miracle of survival. For Brandon and Julia, that second chance became their forever. As the sun set behind their little farmhouse, its golden light spilled through the window, falling gently on their hands, still holding each other, still unbroken. A story once written in tears, now rewritten in hope. And somewhere in the stillness of that evening, love whispered softly, "You're home."